Hello, everyone. This week we're going to deal with the topics of common property resources, public goods, and the related topic of how economists deal with the environment in their models. We're going to first talk about externalities in a little more formal way than we're used to, as well as some of the policy responses to externalities that economists put forward. Then we're going to wrap up with a few other policy implications of externalities. And then we're going to move on to the different topic of types of goods, including common property resources and public goods. And then just to close off, we're going to use this typology of goods to describe the issue of climate change, or at least one way that economists understand that issue. So let's start with the theory of externalities. You should be familiar with these two concepts already. A negative externality is a harmful side effect or unintended consequence of economic activity that affects someone not directly involved in that activity. And similarly, a positive externality is a benefit that's accruing to someone outside of an economic activity. Here, the two examples I've got are the noise pollution caused by air travel, as well as these certain social benefits that come along with public education. So how do we model? Let's start with a negative externality. For a negative externality, we have our normal marginal benefits curve and marginal cost curve. In this case, we are talking about a market for t-shirts. Normally, we've got our private marginal cost curve or supply curve, and this is what we should already be familiar with, and our demand curve. And wherever they're equal is where the outcome of the market will be. If there were no negative externalities, this would be a socially efficient outcome, provided the market is competitive. But if there are externalities, that means that there are certain costs that individuals outside of this transaction are suffering. If it's t-shirts, it might be pollution from runoff of the production of cotton, or pollution from the factory where they're made. Could be a number of things. The way that we incorporate this into the model is we create a social marginal cost curve that lies above the private marginal cost curve. And so the social marginal cost curve incorporates both the real explicitly paid costs of the firm producing the output, as well as the more dispersed, less directly monetary costs that everyone else is suffering. And in this model, we assume that it's a fixed amount of additional externalized cost per unit of production, so it's just $3 more per t-shirt produced. Because of this, if we incorporate all of the marginal costs that are accruing to everyone in society, this market actually results in too many t-shirts being produced and then being sold at too low a cost. So, how do we deal with this? Well, what we can do is we can tax production of this good. And that's what a Pigovian tax is. Pigovian tax is named for the economist Pigou, who was active in Great Britain in the early 1900s. He's actually one of Keynes's teachers. But anyway, a Pigovian tax tries to make the private marginal cost equal to the social marginal cost by taxing producers on each unit that they produce. So in our previous example, we've got $3 of social cost. Let's assume that we get the amount of the Pigovian tax correct. So we tax the producer $3 more per shirt that they produce. And what this does is it generates now a more socially optimal outcome where private marginal costs are equal to social marginal costs. But if this Pigovian tax is $3, what we see in this example here is the price actually only increases by $2. And this is because the demand curve is not perfectly inelastic. As long as the demand curve is not perfectly inelastic, the full amount of the tax increase cannot be passed on to consumers. The producer eats some of it. On the other hand, if we've got a positive externality, then that means that we've got too little of a good being supplied. The benefits for it are not being experienced only by the people involved in the transaction. And so we generate a similar curve as we did in the negative externality case, only this time it's on the marginal benefit side. So we have a social marginal benefits curve that includes both the private marginal benefits and the kind of dispersed externalized benefits. And we can respond to it policy-wise in a very similar way. rather than taxing production, we can subsidize consumption. And we see this policy enacted quite regularly. Subsidization for owning electric vehicles, for installation of solar panels. All of these sorts of policies are in effect Pigovian subsidies. And it has the same effect of generating an outcome that is more socially efficient. So just to do a quick example of a Pigovian tax. Here we've got our normal supply and demand diagram. It's a private marginal cost curve, downward sloping marginal benefits curve, and then somewhere above this private marginal cost curve is a social marginal cost curve. And so the outcome of the market, we'll call that Q sub m and P sub m. And then we'll also have the socially optimal level. That is the level of output that would prevail if we had a Pigovian tax equal to the social marginal costs. And that's P sub t and Q sub t. So in this example, the difference between P sub m and P sub t is the change in price from the Pigovian tax. And the distance here is the change in quantity. And the vertical distance between these two curves is the externalized cost per unit. And if we go just one step further here into welfare analysis, this whole area here that I'm shading in green are the additional social costs from production in the absence of any sort of intervention. So just wanted to give you a quick kind of tour of the diagram. So some things to keep in mind about Pigovian taxes, and to a lesser extent subsidies, is that the Pigovian tax does not eliminate a negative externality. The image I've got in the background here is of a lead and zinc mining town in Oklahoma called Pitcher. And there are these giant piles that are just laden with lead that are tailings from the mine that have led to this place having to be abandoned because the lead content's just so high that people are getting sick. So even if there were a Pigovian tax on the production of lead and zinc that was mined in that town, that wouldn't eliminate the existence of the negative impact. It would just make sure that the benefits and costs of those impacts are in balance once we kind of sum across all of society. So because of that, how the revenue generated by Pigovian taxes is spent is really important. Ideally, it would be spent on repairing damages caused through production, but often it is not. Additionally, getting the size of a Pigovian tax correct is very difficult. We have to estimate these dispersed social benefits or costs, and it's difficult to get that right. That's not to say that we need to get it 100% right to improve the outcome, but we need to be doing at least better than the market was doing on its own. And so we need to be careful about the size of that tax. And finally, taxation is not without its own costs. It's difficult to implement a Pigovian tax on every good that generates a negative externality. So in practice, what most economies that have instituted this sort of policy on a wide scale have done is they've focused on upstream materials that are used in the productive process of a bunch of different goods. So for instance, fossil fuels, right? If that is a prime target for a Pigovian tax. Another issue that was talked about in this chapter that I'm not going to go into in too much detail is valuing the environment. So economists, how do we value these dispersed benefits? Well, elements of the environment have both economic and non-economic value, but there's usually not just some analogous market price. For instance, the Wasatch Front is incredibly valuable for people in terms of recreation, habitat for animals, all these sorts of things. And it's difficult to figure out what that has a dollar value for because there's no market for that, right? There's not, an analogous Wasatch Front somewhere else that's for sale on the market for someone to buy. So economists have to find roundabout ways of estimating the value of nature. Oftentimes this just devolves into somewhat clever ways of asking people. For instance, their willingness to pay for the services they receive from the environment, or their willingness to accept losing those services, essentially how much they would have to be paid to accept a loss in those services. All of these methods are imperfect and have their own challenges, but I would argue that it is at least an attempt to value these things that don't have market value, and that has some policy implications that are useful. So there are a number of different approaches to managing the environmental impact of economic activity, and here are a few options. Pollution standards are one, and this simply says, a firm or an individual or whoever can only emit so much, and beyond that they are charged for it, or taxed, or punished, or sanctioned in some way. These are very, very difficult to implement and to enforce because it's very difficult to measure. A more effective approach that is used quite often are technology-based regulations. So these are requirements that firms or consumers use a particular method. A really common example of this in the US, for instance, and I believe almost globally, is the requirement that cars have catalytic converters to reduce their emissions. Pigouvian taxes we've already talked about a bit, and these are kind of just adjusting the equilibrium outcome of the market through taxing or subsidizing. And finally, there's tradable pollution permits, and this is often a compromise environmental policy that is come up time and time again. The idea here is that a government gives out a bunch of permits to firms who generate pollution, and they are required to essentially kind of use up these permits if they want to pollute. But we also allow those permits to be traded among firms and other interested parties. And by doing this, the idea is that if that market is competitive, it would lead to all the pollution that is generated being the most efficient use of that kind of pollution budget. The common old example of this being used in a different context than, say, emissions is management of fisheries, the so-called ITQs, individual transferable quotas, where people have a certain right to a certain amount of harvesting of fish from a lake, say, and they are able to trade those rights around so that the most efficient fisherman is able to harvest the most fish. There are certain issues with this policy that need to be addressed. The competitiveness of the quota market is very important. This sort of policy has been implemented in some places. The EU, for instance, has a tradable pollution permit system within its own borders, but it's not as widespread elsewhere. So moving right along here, I want to talk about types of goods. If you look at this chart here, we've got two axes. One axis that is the excludability and non-excludability of good, and the rivalrous and non-rivalrousness of a good. A normal private good, which is kind of the goods we've been talking about through most of this course, are private goods. Consumption of a private good is rivalrous in that if I consume it, you can't. If I eat an apple, that means you can't eat the apple. It's also excludable. That means that I have some enforceable property right over the good saying that if I have it, you cannot have it as well. And this is kind of what economics deals best with, are these private goods. But we've got three other types of goods here. So let's go to the next one over, common property resources, which are rivalrous but non-excludable. Another good example here that I've already talked about a bit when I was talking about ITQs is a fishery. Fishing out of a lake with a fixed number of fish in it is rivalrous. Beyond a certain point, if I overfish, that's going to impact other people fishing on the lake. But, at least in the absence of regulation, it's non-excludable. Anyone can walk up to the lake and fish. And this creates a lot of problems that we're going to talk about in a moment that involve over-exploitation of a resource. Another type of good is artificially scarce goods, also sometimes called club goods. Club goods are excludable, but they are non-rivalrous. And so a really good example here would be access to a swimming pool or a gym membership. And so these are things where if I use it, that doesn't mean you can't use it, but I can be legally excluded from access, or you can be legally excluded from access. And then finally, there are public goods, which are both non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So my consumption doesn't inhibit your consumption, and I also can't effectively exclude you from it. Really great examples here are public parks, but also public roads are a public good. It is important to note that any single good can kind of change where it lies on this grid in some ways, and we'll talk about that in more detail later. First, let's talk about artificially scarce goods. So they're excludable but non-rivalrous. Another example here would be things like internet, right? Artificially scarce goods are modeled by only having a demand curve, and the marginal cost of supplying the good is zero. There isn't actually any sort of definable market equilibrium in this case. It's just one demand curve. So the supplier of a club good can choose where they place the price and quantity on that demand curve. So it'd be an example like this. The producer could pick any point here. In this case, they chose a price of $30, which leads to 80 units of this good being supplied per month. And there is still some consumer surplus and producer surplus, but they can really essentially select any point they want on that curve. Common pool resources are a little more interesting. They're not excludable and rivalrous, so we can think about it as each person that consumes the resource imposes costs on the other people that use that resource. So the way that we can model that is here. We've got a certain private cost curve. We've assumed it to be fixed in this case. We've got an upward sloping social cost curve. So this is representing the costs that each actor is imposing on other actors who are, in this case, selling fishing trips on a lake. And then we also here have a revenue per unit, in this case revenue per trip. And so in the absence of any sort of regulation, this is going to result in a total number of trips equal to T sub E. So that's way out here on the right-hand side. But the actual socially efficient outcome is T star. So we can deal with this issue in a number of ways. We could impose a tax on producers. We could institute individual transferable quotas. There's a whole bunch of responses. In fact, there's also kind of community responsibility systems that tend to work well in these situations on a smaller scale. Water rights management organizations in India have sometimes been very effective by having farmers able to kind of control the access to water among themselves. So one major issue with common property resources is the so-called tragedy of the commons. And that's just a situation in which an unregulated CPR is seriously degraded due to overuse. Public goods suffer from different problems than common property resources. So public goods are non-excludable, non-rivalrous, and there's an incentive to use public goods but not contribute to their production. And this is the so-called free rider problem. This is one of the reasons why we cannot rely on markets to provide public goods. It will always underprovide public goods because there's no way for a producer of a public good to effectively exclude people from using it and avoid this free rider problem. And this is why some things in society are just most efficiently provided by government, because they're public goods that lack any sort of way to properly exclude the benefits from some people. So oftentimes, a good can change what type it is over time. So a really simple example here would be thinking about a highway that becomes overloaded. So a highway is essentially a public good at the start of it. My use of it doesn't prevent your use from it, and no one can be excluded from using it. Beyond a certain level of utilization, at a certain point, it becomes rivalrous. So now my use of a public highway is imposing costs on others through creating a traffic jam. And in this way, beyond a certain level of utilization, a public good can become a common property resource. So we go from an issue where we have problems with the free rider problem to the tragedy of the commons. Now, there are ways that you can respond to this. One instance is to assign property rights. So we can put up a toll gate. And this now makes the formerly public highway excludable. And so that is essentially the transformation of a public good into a common property resource and then finally into a private good. Similarly, property rights can be established over certain public goods to turn them into artificially scarce goods. For instance, if there's a community pool that people who live in that community can use for free, the city could decide to put up a fence, install a gate, and start charging people. That would essentially convert that public good into an artificially scarce good. Now, the most important story that we can tell with this is the relation to climate change. At the beginning of industrialization, the capacity of our atmosphere to accept greenhouse gases was just assumed to be a public good. If I did it, it didn't impose a cost on anyone else, it wasn't excludable, it's not rivalrous. But it's become clear that it actually behaves far much more like a common pool resource. There's a limited capacity of the atmosphere to absorb pollutants over time, and so my emitting carbon dioxide imposes costs on others. So there's a number of ways that society can respond to it in relation to our chart of types of goods. We can institute individual transferable quotas and allow people to trade around, which is essentially assigning property rights and converting this common pool resource into a private good. But other policy options would be to manage it as a CPR, and that would be more in line with process regulations, community management, things like that. But either way, measurement and enforcement is an issue, and we're still going to have the issue of tragedy of the commons if we don't solve this problem. So let's wrap things up here. Negative externalities can be addressed through internalizing externalized costs through taxation, ITQs, or direct regulation of production to prevent those social costs from occurring in the first place. Positive externalities can be addressed through subsidies, so kind of the opposite end of the Pikovian tax. Common pool resources may result in tragedy of the commons if not managed. Public goods will be underproduced without intervention. This is the so-called free rider problem. And finally, goods may change type over time, and this is a particularly important issue when it comes to the capacity of the atmosphere to accept greenhouse gases. All right, I think that's all I got for this week. Thanks.